Hello, Algebra 2ers. Today we're going to be solving with factoring. So up until this point, we have learned all the different ways to factor, whether we've been given 2 terms, 3 terms, 4 terms, all those things. And all of our answers up until this point have been left in parentheses. We say this is one factor, let's say x plus 2. And then the other factor was x plus 3. So far, this has been your final answer, and today, with solving, this is no longer going to be your final answer. We're going to add one more step to the process. So what you're going to need today are your notes, pen or a pencil, and a calculator. Before we start with any example problems, we have to talk about something called the zero product property. And what that means in words is that if the product of two expressions is zero, then one or both of those expressions must have been equal to zero. So what we mean in algebra is if we say a times b is equal to zero, then a or b has to be equal to zero. So if we say 3 times 0 is equal to 0, one of our things that we multiplied had to be 0 in order to get back 0. All the zero product property is trying to say is that if you have something times something equal to 0, one of those somethings had to be 0 in order to equal to 0. So if we have something like this in the means, x plus 5 times x plus 2 is equal to 0, then we can say that x plus 5 is equal to 0 or x plus 2 is equal to 0. And then if we were to solve for x or get x alone, we would get back x is equal to a negative 5 and x is equal to a negative 2. So the means or the meaning of the zero product property is going to help us with factoring because we're going to be solving things like that. Okay, so we only have 3 examples today. So the first example is we need to factor x squared plus 9x plus 14. When we ask ourselves, when we need to factor, the first thing we should be asking ourselves is there a common GCF between the 3 terms? So do they have a common number or a common variable? And in this case, they do not. So after that, we need to ask ourselves, how many terms do I have? Well, I have 3 terms, so I know I'm going to have to factor using the trinomial method, which is we need to set up our parentheses first, and we're going to say this first thing times the first thing is going to get back to x squared, and the last thing times the last thing is going to get back to a 14, and then we know the outside plus the inside after we've multiplied the outside plus the inside, that's going to get back to the 9x. So that's what we need to figure out. So we know the first thing times the first thing, or x times x, gets me back to this x squared. Now we need to figure out the last thing times the last thing has to get back to multiply to a 14. Well, the factors of 14 are 1 and 14 and 2 and 7. But we want the pair such that when we multiply the outside times the inside, we get back the middle number, 9x. Okay? So what we need to figure out is this thing times the last thing, or the outside times the outside, plus the inside times the inside has to get me back to a 9x. So if I put a 1 and a 14 here, a positive 1 and a positive 14, I'm saying x times 14 is 14x, and 1 times x is a plus 1x. Well, 14 plus 1 did not get me back to the middle term 9x, so I know that I'm going to need to do the other factors. I need a 2 and a 7, because when we take x times 7, we get back 7x, and when we take 2 times x, we get back 2x, and 7x plus 2x gets me back to the 9x in the middle. So my final answer is what we just found out in those parentheses, x plus 2 and x plus 7 equal to 0. So now my second step, or the new step that we have never done until this video, is we're saying if we have a factor times a factor to get back to a product to 0, we need to set x plus 2 equal to 0. So when I say set it equal to 0, I mean x plus 2 equals 0. Write that mini equation, okay? And then we need to set x plus 7 equal to 0. And now in order to find two solutions, we just have to solve for x or get x alone. So minus 2 from both sides, we get x is equal to a negative 2. And then we minus 7 from both sides, so we get x is equal to a negative 7. So those are my two solutions, and that is my first example. Let's move on to number 2. All right, example number 2. We need to factor 4x squared plus 22x plus 10. So let's ask ourselves, is there a common factor between 4, 22, and 10? And there is, so let's take out a 2. So if we divide everything by 2, and since we have an equation now, whatever happens on the left side has to happen on the right side. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So 4x divided by 2 is 2x squared. 22x divided by 2 is plus 11x. 10 divided by 2 is plus 5. And of course, 0 divided by 2 is still 0. So now we have three terms. So we're going to have to factor just like we did on example 1. So now we need two numbers that multiply back to, or two terms that multiply back to a 2x squared. So that's going to be 2x and x. Now we need to know the factors of 5. Well, the factors of 5 are simply 1 and 5, but where we place them this time matters. It matters if I put the 5 here or here, because when we multiply the outside and the inside back, we want to get back a positive 11x, okay? So I'm going to try doing a 5 first and then a 1. So let me check if I got the right thing or if I got back my expression. So let's take 2x times 1, we get 2x plus 5 times x is a 5x. Well, 2x plus 5x is equal to 7x. So that doesn't get me back to my middle term of 11x. So instead, we're probably going to want the 1 here and the 5 there. So when I take 2x times 5, I get 10x. And when I take 1 times x, I get 1x, which gets me back to 11x like my middle term asked me for. So my answer should be, I'll make a little box here so you know what the answer is, 2x, oops, I forgot my signs. My signs should have been plus 1 and plus 5. So in my final answer, I should have gotten 2x plus 1 times x plus 5 equal to 0. And now my second step, we need to solve for x, and in order to do that, we have to set each factor equal to 0. So I want 2x plus 1 equal to 0, and I want x minus, or plus 5 equal to 0. So now we have to solve for x. So subtract 1 to get x alone. We're left with 2x is equal to a negative 1. Divide by a negative, or divide by 2. So we get x is equal to a negative 1/2. And we need to solve for the other one. So subtract 5 from both sides. And we get x is equal to a negative 5. So my two final answers are x is equal to a negative 5 and x is equal to a negative 1/2. All right, we have an additional step on the last example, example 3. We need to first get our equation into standard form. When we say standard form for factoring, we want the ax squared term plus the bx term plus the number all equal to 0. And we want this a to stay positive. We want a, or the x squared term, to stay positive. So in my example, I have 9x minus 8 is equal to x squared. So in order to get one side equal to 0, I could subtract 9x from both sides and add 8 to both sides, or I could subtract x squared to the other side. But in order to keep my x squared positive, I would want to subtract 9x and add 8 to both sides, so that way this side becomes 0. So to get into standard form, we would need 0 equal to x squared minus 9x plus 8. And we're going to use this equation to factor. We're not going to use that equation that we were originally given. Once we have it set equal to 0, then we're going to factor from there. So we know we have 0 equal to 2 sets of parentheses. I need my x times x to get back to x squared. Now I need factors of 8 that add up to 9. Well, the factors of 8 are 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. 1 plus 8 gets me back to 9 and 2 plus 4 gets me back to 6. So I would want the 1 and the 8 option. And in order for it to multiply to a positive number but add to a negative number, we know that these numbers have to be negative. And so now we can jump down to our final step, which is set each one equal to 0. So my first factor, x minus 1, is equal to 0, and my next factor is x minus 8 is equal to 0. So add 1, we get x is equal to 1. Add 8 to both sides for my second factor, and we're left with x is equal to 8. So takeaway from today, once you've factored like we've been learning how to factor, you need to set each factor or each thing in the parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x like a normal, simple algebraic equation. Get x alone. I want to thank you for taking such good notes today, and I shall see you soon.